I've worked in the mortuary department for 15 years, and what I'm about to share still makes my skin crawl. I've seen my fair share of strange occurrences, bodies seemingly shifting positions, unexplained noises in empty corridors, but nothing compares to what happened that winter night. It was during my night shift supervision when my colleague, James, called me in a panic. His voice trembled as he described what he'd just witnessed through the security monitors. I rushed to the security office, and what I saw on that grainy footage would haunt me forever. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. The front entrance camera showed a man in a thin hospital gown, standing motionless at our morgue entrance. The temperature outside was well below freezing, yet there he stood, barefoot on the icy concrete. His skin had an unnatural pallor that made my stomach turn. If you're intrigued by real accounts from the morgue, like, share, and subscribe now. There are stories that need to be told, experiences that defy explanation. James had already attempted communication through the intercom. The figure remained still, head slightly tilted downward, hands hanging limply at his side. The security footage captured an odd distortion around him, like a subtle static that shouldn't have been there. Following protocol, I sent our night porter to investigate. As I watched through the monitor, the porter approached the door cautiously. The moment he pushed it open, the figure vanished. Not ran away, not stepped aside, simply ceased to exist. The porter's flashlight beam cut through empty air where the man had stood seconds before. No footprints in the fresh snow. No indication anyone had been there at all. Yet on our monitor, the figure remained, still standing, still waiting. I felt my reality cracking. The porter returned, visibly shaken, confirming what we'd seen on camera. We rewound and reviewed the footage multiple times. The man never moved. He appeared suddenly at 2:47 a.m. And even after he'd vanished in reality, his image remained burned into our security feed. The real horror, though, was yet to come. The next morning, I was processing new arrivals. We'd had 3 bodies brought in during the early hours. As I reviewed the paperwork, my blood ran cold. There, in the admission files, was a photograph that made my heart stop. Male, approximately 60 years old, pronounced dead at 10:23 p.m. the previous night. The face in the photograph was unmistakable. The same man who had stood at our door. The time of arrival at our facility was logged at 10:45 p.m., 4 hours before he appeared at our entrance. I rushed to the cold storage unit, my hands shaking as I checked the number. The body was there, exactly where it should be, unchanged since arrival. Same hospital gown, same pallid complexion. Even the slight tilt of the head matched what we'd seen on camera. The investigation that followed only deepened the mystery. The hospital confirmed his time of death. Multiple staff members had witnessed the body's transportation to our facility. The security footage showed the arrival van, the body being wheeled in, everything documented and time-stamped. Yet somehow, 4 hours later, he stood at our door. We ran every possible technical check on the security system. No glitches, no tampering, no explanations. The footage remains in our archives, a digital testament to something that defies rational explanation. The incident changed something in our facility. The night staff began reporting cold spots near the entrance. The security cameras would occasionally show brief static at exactly 2:47 a.m. Some claimed to hear knocking when no one was there. I've kept quiet about this for years, sharing it only with close colleagues who've experienced similar, inexplicable events. But this wasn't a trick of light or a technical malfunction. This wasn't mass hysteria or an elaborate prank. This was something else entirely. To this day, I can't pass by our entrance during the night shift without remembering that figure. The dead man who came back to knock on our door, I've often wondered what would have happened if we'd managed to speak with him, if we'd learned what drew him back to our threshold that night. Some questions, I've learned, are better left unanswered. In my line of work, we see death every day, but sometimes death sees us too. And sometimes, just sometimes, it comes knocking at your door. James transferred to the day shift after that night. I stayed on, but I never view the security footage alone anymore. Some nights when I'm locking up, I swear I can feel eyes watching me from the darkness beyond our entrance. And every winter, when the snow falls and the air grows bitter with cold, I remember the dead man who stood at our door, waiting to be let in. The footage still exists in our archives, though few have the stomach to watch it. Those who have seen it don't sleep well for weeks after. There are things in this world that exist in the shadows between life and death, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to know, and sometimes they come looking for us. In my 20 years working in the morgue, I've developed what most would call a thick skin. Death doesn't frighten me anymore. Or at least, that's what I thought until that night. What I experienced changed everything I thought I knew about death, about science, about reality itself. It was a Tuesday night in late autumn. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune above me as I worked alone in the preparation room. The clock had just struck 11 p.m. when they brought him in, a John Doe, victim of a hit and run. Male, early 30s, no identification, no personal effects, just another nameless body on my table. The routine was simple, one I'd performed thousands of times. Document any identifying marks, take preliminary photographs, and attach the morgue identification tag. Standard procedure, nothing remarkable. He was in surprisingly good condition for a vehicle collision victim. Almost peaceful looking, if not for the slight discoloration around his neck that didn't quite match the reported cause of death. I made a mental note to mention it to the pathologist in the morning. I secured the identification tag around his big toe, double-checking the knot as always. The plastic strap was firm but not tight, perfect by protocol standards. I turned to my computer to log the preliminary details. The soft tink of plastic hitting tile made me freeze. I turned slowly, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. The tag lay on the floor, a good 3 feet from the examination table. The strap was intact, not broken or cut, just removed. I told myself it was just a loose knot. These things happen, right? I picked up the tag, my fingers slightly trembling, and secured it again. This time I triple-checked the knot, pulling it taut enough to leave an impression on the skin. I forced myself to focus on the paperwork, but my ears were straining for any sound. 2 minutes later, tink. The tag was on the floor again. My mouth went dry. I checked the strap, still perfectly intact. No signs of stretching or tampering. It was as if someone had simply slipped it off, but that was impossible. The toe was cold, swollen. The tag couldn't just slip off. I secured it again, my hands now visibly shaking. This time I stood and watched. 30 seconds passed. A minute. 2 minutes. Then I saw it. The tag moved, not fell, moved. It twisted slightly, as if being manipulated by invisible fingers, and then simply slid off. I backed away from the table, my heart thundering in my chest. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. In a surge of desperate rationality, I grabbed my stapler. If the tag wouldn't stay tied, I'd make damn sure it stayed attached to the body bag. I zipped him up, stapled the tag securely through the thick plastic, and practically ran from the room. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that tag moving on its own. By morning, I had almost convinced myself I'd imagined it all. Stress, exhaustion, an overactive imagination. But when I returned to work the next day, my world tilted on its axis. The body bag was unzipped. Not torn, not cut. Unzipped. As if someone had simply pulled the zipper down. The tag was gone. Not on the floor. Not anywhere in the room. Simply gone. But that wasn't the worst part. The body's position had changed. Only slightly, but I'm certain of it. The head was turned just a few degrees to the left, and the right hand, which I distinctly remembered placing flat against his side, was now slightly curled. The surveillance footage showed nothing. No movement, no visitors, nothing out of ordinary. Just static-filled frames between 3:27 a.m. and 3:28 a.m. And then everything appeared exactly as I found it. The autopsy later revealed something that still haunts me. The discoloration I'd noticed around his neck, it wasn't from the accident. The pathologist determined he had been strangled before the hit and run. The accident was staged. To this day, I wonder if he was trying to tell us something. If whatever force kept removing that tag was trying to ensure we'd look closer, investigate deeper. They eventually identified him, a whistleblower who had gone missing 3 days before his death. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the morgue, I think about him, about how many other bodies might have stories to tell. If only we knew how to listen. The tag from that night was never found, but I keep a spare one in my desk drawer as a reminder. A reminder that death doesn't always mean the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning, and sometimes the dead have ways of making sure their stories get told. Like many people, I never planned to work in a morgue. I was a pre-med student who needed a job, and the hospital's mortuary department was hiring. That was 12 years ago. Now, I can't imagine doing anything else. Death has been my teacher, showing me both the fragility and resilience of human life. But sometimes, death teaches lessons that shake the very foundation of what we believe is possible. Let me tell you about something that happened last winter. Something I still can't explain. It was a Thursday night, and I was pulling a double shift because my colleague had called in sick. The morgue is always eerily quiet at night, but there's usually a comfort in that silence. It's peaceful, almost meditative. But not that night. We had received 5 bodies that day, all routine cases except for one. A 42-year-old male found unresponsive in his apartment. No signs of trauma, no obvious cause of death. The responding paramedics noted that his apartment was immaculately clean, almost obsessively so. No medications, no alcohol, no drugs. Just a man who stopped living. I started my routine checks around 11 p.m. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I moved between the examination tables, documenting and preparing bodies for the morning shift. When I reached him, let's call him case 247, something felt off. I can't explain it, but the air around his table felt different, heavier somehow. He had been with us for about an hour, and rigor mortis was already setting in. His joints were stiff when I checked them. His fingers curled slightly, like he was trying to hold on to something. His face was peaceful, though, almost serene. I turned away to grab a body bag from the supply cabinet. It couldn't have been more than 10 seconds. But when I turned back, my world stopped. He was sitting upright, not slumped, not leaning, sitting perfectly straight like a soldier at attention. His spine was rigid, his head held high, and his eyes were open, staring directly at the wall in front of him. I dropped the body bag. The sound echoed through the morgue like a gunshot, but he didn't flinch, didn't move, just sat there, as still as a statue. My medical training kicked in, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Cadaveric spasm? No. That occurs immediately at death. Gas buildup? That could cause movement, but not like this. Not this controlled. This purposeful. His lips were slightly parted, as if caught in the middle of a word. I found myself straining to hear something. Anything. But the morgue remained silent, except for my own ragged breathing. I forced myself to approach. Each step felt like walking through cement. The temperature around his table had dropped dramatically. I could see my breath misting in the air. When I reached him, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. His head was turned slightly, just enough that his eyes now seemed to be looking directly at me. With trembling hands, I grabbed his shoulders. His skin was like ice, even through my gloves. As I tried to ease him back down, his body resisted. Not like normal rigor mortis, but like something was holding him up. It took all my strength to finally lay him flat again. The moment his back touched the table, all the tension left his body. His eyes closed on their own, like someone drifting off to sleep. I stood there, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. For the remaining 6 hours of my shift, I couldn't bring myself to look in his direction again. I could feel his presence, though, like a weight pressing against my back. Every small noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. When my supervisor arrived in the morning, I told her everything. I expected disbelief, maybe even concern for my mental state. Instead, she nodded gravely and said something that chills me to this day. That's the 3rd one this year. She wouldn't elaborate, but later that day I did some digging. 2 other bodies, both brought in under similar circumstances, found alone. No clear cause of death, immaculate living conditions. And both had been reported to sit up on their examination tables. The autopsy revealed something strange. His brain showed patterns consistent with extreme meditation, similar to what's seen in long-time Buddhist monks. His apartment yielded no further clues, except for a journal. The last entry, written the day he died, contained just one line. What did he figure out? What connection did he share with the other 2 cases? These questions haunt me still. Sometimes when I'm alone in the morgue at night, I think about case 247, about what he might have discovered, and what secrets he took with him to the other side, or perhaps didn't quite leave behind. The morgue has taught me many things over the years, but that night taught me something new. Sometimes the line between life and death isn't as clear as we think, and sometimes the dead have one last thing to show us before they go. I still work the night shift, but I never turn my back on the examination tables anymore, just in case someone else decides to sit up and share their final secret. Before I continue, if you want to hear more true stories from the morgue's darkest hours, make sure to subscribe. Some stories need to be shared, even if they keep you awake at night. It was a Wednesday evening in late autumn, the kind of night where the wind whispers against the building's old walls and shadows seem to breathe in the corners of empty corridors. I was finishing my shift. Just 30 minutes left before I could head home to my cat and a much-needed glass of wine. That's when they brought her in. Jane Doe number 437, an elderly woman who'd passed away in the hospital 2 days prior. No family had claimed her, despite the hospital's best effort. Her paperwork was sparse. No known relatives, no emergency contacts, just a simple medical history and time of death. I remember thinking how lonely it seemed, dying without anyone to mourn you. Her face was peaceful, though, marked with deep wrinkles that suggested she'd smiled often in life. Her silver hair was neatly combed, and someone at the hospital had taken care to dress her in a clean white gown. I was just finishing her intake forms when my phone rang. It was the front desk security guard, his voice unusually hesitant. "There's a group here," he said. "They're asking about the woman in room 37. My stomach clenched. Something in his tone made the hair on my neck stand up. Room 37 was where we'd just placed her, not 15 minutes ago. When I reached the front desk, I saw them, 3 figures standing perfectly still in the dimly lit lobby. A man and 2 women, all wearing clothing that seemed wrong. Not modern wrong, but wrong like looking at an old photograph come to life. Their clothes were immaculately pressed, but the styles belonged to another era entirely. The air around them felt different, colder somehow, static, like the moment before a lightning strike. "Are you family?" I asked, my voice echoing too loudly in the quiet lobby. The man nodded, his movement unnaturally smooth. "We need to see her." Their faces. I'll never forget their faces. They were beautiful in a way that made your eyes want to slide away, like looking at something that shouldn't exist in our world. Their skin was too perfect, too pale, like marble statues in moonlight. Protocol dictated that I verify their relationship before allowing viewing, but something stopped me from asking more questions. Something primitive in my brain was screaming at me to run, to hide, to get away from these people who weren't quite people. I led them to the viewing room, my footsteps echoing in the corridor while theirs made no sound at all. The fluorescent lights flickered as we passed beneath them, creating strange shadows that seemed to follow our movement. When I uncovered her face, they didn't move closer. They stood in perfect formation, their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made my skin crawl. No tears, no trembling lips, no signs of grief. Just that unwavering stare. Then the woman in the middle spoke, her voice like dry leaves rustling in wind. "We should have come sooner." My mouth was dry as I offered the customary condolences. I'm sorry for your loss." The man turned to me then, and his smile. God, his smile. It was like looking into an abyss that smiled back. She was never lost. They left as suddenly as they'd appeared, their movements too fluid, too coordinated. I stood frozen until the sound of the front door closing echoed through the building. Racing back to my desk, I pulled up her files again. My hands shook as I scrolled through the documents. There it was, in black and white. No known family, no contacts, no visitors. No one had come looking for her at the hospital. The security footage the next day showed only static during the time they were supposedly there. 20 minutes of electromagnetic interference, something our system had never experienced before or since. But here's what truly haunts me. When I returned to room 37 that night, something had changed. Her face, which had been peaceful before, now wore an expression of profound sadness, and clutched in her hand, her previously empty hand, was an old tarnished locket. When we opened it, we found a sepia photograph inside. 3 people in formal Victorian clothing, standing exactly as they had in our lobby. The photograph was dated 1887. I still work at the morgue, but I never stay late anymore. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I hear footsteps in empty corridors, footsteps that make no sound. And sometimes, when I pass room 37, I swear I can hear whispers. "We should have come sooner." The dead tell stories, if you're willing to listen. But some stories make you question everything you thought you knew about life, death, and what might exist in between. And sometimes, family comes for you even if they're a century too late. The shift started like any other. I had settled into my routine, moving bodies in and out of storage, logging entries, preparing for the morning staff. Then, around midnight, a nurse wheeled in a body from the hospital. Her face was pale, her hands gripping the paperwork a little too tightly. She practically shoved the file at me, muttered something under her breath, and hurried out without so much as a glance back. That was my first warning sign. I sighed and glanced at the paperwork. Male, mid-50s. Time of death, 10:45 p.m. Cause, cardiac arrest. Nothing unusual. Still, something didn't sit right with me. I pulled back the sheet, expecting the usual cold, lifeless skin. But my fingers recoiled. He was warm. Not just residual warmth. Bodies sometimes held heat for a while. But this was different. Unsettlingly warm, as if he'd just stepped out of bed. I swallowed hard. Maybe the hospital had rushed things. Maybe the body hadn't had time to cool. But an hour had passed since death was called. That warmth should have faded, trying to ignore the creeping unease. I placed a hand over his chest. No rise or fall. I pressed my fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. He was dead. My brain told me that. My gut screamed otherwise. Shaking it off, I logged the body into storage, tagged his toe, and rolled the tray into the cold chamber. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, I turned to leave, and then I heard it. A breath. A long, shuddering inhale. I froze, every muscle locking up. My mind raced for logical explanations. Post-mortem gas. The body releasing air. I had seen it before, heard it before, but this sounded too deep, too deliberate. I turned back slowly, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The storage door stood sealed. The room was silent. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was just tired. Then it came again. Louder. Closer. I yanked open the chamber door and pulled the tray back out so fast it nearly tipped. The body lay exactly as I had left it, except the mouth. It had been closed before. Now, it was slightly open. Not wide, just enough to make my stomach churn. I forced myself to check again. My fingers pressed against his skin. It was still disturbingly warm. I checked his pulse. Nothing. I leaned in, hesitating, feeling for the faintest wisp of breath against my cheek. The air was still. I needed answers. My hands shook as I dialed the hospital. When the supervisor arrived, she took one look at the body and went pale. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the paperwork, rereading the time of death. "This isn't the first time this has happened with this doctor," she whispered. Her words sent a chill through me. Not just fear, but something deeper. Something gnawing at my sense of reality. How many bodies had been sent here, still warm? Still breathing? Had someone, somewhere, woken up in one of these storage chambers, gasping for air in the dark? The hospital retrieved the body, offering no further explanation. No paperwork corrections. No additional details. Just silence. I never found out what happened after that night. But sometimes when I stand in that morgue surrounded by the dead, I wonder how many of them were actually dead when they arrived. How many had felt the cold embrace of the storage chamber before their hearts truly stopped. And if I listen closely, sometimes, just sometimes, I swear, I can still hear breathing. If you found this story unsettling, imagine experiencing it firsthand. How many bodies have been sent to the morgue too soon? If you want more terrifying real-life horror stories like this, make sure to subscribe, because some things are too chilling to be ignored. Even now, I still wonder, did I store a man alive that night?